Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm John Carlson. I direct the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I am delighted to welcome you all to today's lecture. This is our last of our public events of this academic year. The title of our lecture is Logos, Culture, and the Commons with Professor Akeel Bilgrami. If you're here to learn about logos, I have some disappointing news. That's not what this event is about. But rest assured, you, I think, are in for a real treat here. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders, housekeeping matters. If you would, please silence your cell phones. We are live streaming today's event, so a special shout out to those of you who are watching from home. So glad to have you joining us remotely. You can, as I said, this is our last public event this year, but we will be able to present to you a very full and exciting fall program sometime this summer. So check back on our website, and in the meantime, you might review our YouTube channel for any events that you might have missed from the past. They're all, many of them are all listed there. And this is a special year for us. It's our 20th anniversary of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. There's a lot of activity happening, a lot of changes underway, a lot of planning and new directions, and you'll hear and learn more about those things in the fall. And I also want to just offer a final bit of a final word of thanks, because we have several of our very generous friends of the center here in the audience. Thanks to all of those who are part of our community and who help to, who have come together through the work that we do. And that includes also many faculty, many former students as well. People who come together through these events, but also through their contributions and other forms of support make possible our student scholarships, our research initiatives, our fellowships, and public education programs like today's lecture. So on to today's lecture. This event is part of our Beyond Secularization initiative. That's been one of the two main projects that the center has been running the last few years, along with our Recovering Truth project. Beyond Secularization is a project that really grapples with vital questions around at the intersections of religion, of technology, secularism, public life, with a particular emphasis at understanding how the meanings and the practices of science and technology shape our conceptions of the common good and our pursuits of the common good. I mentioned yesterday, for those of you who are taking copious notes, this will be repetitious, I'm sorry, that there have just been, as you know, stunning technological advances in the last few years, but just in the course of this project, if you think about the emergence of a COVID vaccine, of new technologies that have become, are going up for FDA approval because of gene editing, rise of artificial intelligence, just massive numbers of new opportunities, of new improvements in human life, but they'd never come without social conflicts, debates, and issues around them. Some of you may recall there was a little controversy over the COVID vaccine, or at least some discussion thereof. As well, one of the things I wanted to say is that something that's really distinctive about this project is the way in which, on the one hand, it's trying to kind of peel back these different layers of history, of culture, of human thought, and how those ideas, shape our expectations of science and technology and progress, but also at the same time pushing back at this assumption that science and technology should somehow be removed or separate from religion, and that in the interest of progress or human development, they must remain that way. So I've said enough, and I want to just take a final opportunity. Again, bear with me for those of you who heard this yesterday, but it really is important to recognize the intellectual leadership of this project. Three people in particular that I would be very much remiss if I did not share with you and point them out today. That is Hava Tarosh Samuelson, Ben Hurlbut, there's Ben, and Gaiman Bennett. Where's Gaiman? There's Cayman. All right. Intellectual leaders, drivers, levers as well, forces to be reckoned with, and who have led us on this important work over the last few years. I'm going to now turn things over to Charles McCrary to introduce our speaker today. Charlie has actually had the great opportunity to work on both of our big projects over the last 2 years, the Beyond Secularization and the Recovering Truth project. So if you ply him with a few drinks, and maybe he'll tell you which one he liked more, but I don't want to hear the answer. So he's been with the Beyond Secularization project for 3 years, though. And he's the author of an extremely well-reviewed book entitled Sincerely Held, American Secularism and Its Believers. And we're also really, really delighted with the news that he has been offered and has accepted a tenure-track teaching position as assistant professor of religious studies at Eckerd College in Florida. So we're thrilled with that. As many of you know, the academic job market right now is a meat grinder, and it's just an amazing achievement. We're so proud of you, Charlie. So with that, come on up here. Over to you.
Thanks. Did not think I would also get an introduction, so thank you. Yes, I am Charlie. So those of you who are participating in the conference, we've probably emailed, so this is what my face looks like. Okay, I will make this introduction pretty quick. Dr. Bilgrami is Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. He's had a long and distinguished career, so I think a full introduction would take a very long time. And I am eager to hear the lecture, so I will keep this pretty short. Professor Bilgrami works in two broad fields, the philosophy of mind and language, and second, political philosophy and moral psychology. In the latter area, he has published a number of influential essays, books, and edited volumes on secularism, enchantment, democratic culture, academic freedom, Marx, Gandhi, politics of Islam and Muslims, histories of dissent, the dissenting tradition, and much, much more. And I will just say on a more personal note, last week, some of us in the project, the Beyond Secularization project here at ASU, we read some essays from his 2014 book, Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, and it sparked a really rich discussion. For me, Professor Bilgrami's work is especially notable for its combination of analytical precision and also political and moral clarity. Better than most thinkers, he's able to be precise when dealing in highly conceptual things, but also be clear-eyed and practical when it's time to touch the ground. It's the sort of work that is really hard to write and also vital to read and engage with. So I'm very excited that he is here to think and talk and share with us. Please welcome Akeel Bilgrami.
Thank you, Charlie. It's very nice to be back at ASU, the old friends, and I'm going to. This paper, I'm afraid, this lecture is not really about religion, except I think by the time I come to the end and disclose a secret ideal, you'll see how it's essentially tied to folk and spiritual traditions, and there's a lot to recover of that in our modernity, but you won't get a sense of that until I speak the name of an ideal right at the very end. In his remarkable early work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche makes much of a distinction that he names with a typically evocative classical reference, Apollonian and Dionysian, and he allows it to roam over a wide range of seemingly contrasting phenomena, reason and emotion, harmony and chaos, unity and diversity. But the contrast which he reads into the distinction that I want to focus on in this lecture is the one between the representational and the non-representational. It was Nietzsche's driving brief in that work to restore the importance of the latter against what he took to be the gradual ascendancy of the former over several centuries of Western thought and literary production. Given Nietzsche's immediate interest in a literary form, tragedy, not that he allows himself to be much restricted by that interest, some of his concerns are with the representational and non-representational elements within the dramatic arts. His scholarly claim is that in drama, ever since Euripides, he exempts earlier Attic tragedy from this imbalance. There was an increasing emphasis on the Apollonian or representational, exemplified in the individual actors on the stage front and the narrative that they propel in their words and deeds, over the non-discursive Dionysian elements, exemplified in the specific background role provided by the chorus, which came to have diminishing importance. When he lifts the restricted focus on the arts and moves on to philosophy, Plato's Socrates replaces Euripides as the identified source of this fault line, and logos, that particularly language-centered conception of reason, begins to dominate, while a range of linguistically unarticulated experiences are made secondary. It's interesting that Nietzsche identifies the fault line as early as this. For him, the pre-Socratics had the right balance of Apollonian and Dionysian, and it has been downhill since then. Much of European philosophy since Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, has followed him in this genealogy, describing this long-standing tendency in Western thought as logocentric, describing it as logocentric. But in a different tradition of philosophical scholarship, the fault line is placed at a later date. And the particular nature of the fault is more explicitly visible in the way that it's spelled out. Thus, for instance, Miles Bernier observes that in the Western epistemological tradition, skepticism regarding the external world made a very particular turn in the early modern period with Descartes. No previous skeptic in the tradition, say for example, Pyrrhonian skepticism in the ancient period, had concluded, as Descartes did, that there may not be an external world that there may not be an external world from the possibility that we may not have knowledge of the external world. This Cartesian conclusion disallows that there may be other ways of relating to the world than via knowledge of it, such as perhaps just living in it. It is only with early modernity that the very idea of living in the world came to be seen as so mediated by knowledge of it that to lose knowledge of the world would be to lose the world itself. This diagnosis gives a very precise elaboration of the logocentrism identified in the Nietzschean genealogy, but it places it at a later date, we may assume, because the saturation of living by knowledge is assumed to have come about only as a result of the central place that science, then called natural philosophy, came to have in the intellectual culture in the modern period. Aristotelian science, unlike Aristotelian philosophy, did not have the same dominant status in the culture of Europe as modern science came to have later, even if there were philosophical premonitions of the logocentrism going as far back as Plato's Socrates. But as I read him, Nietzsche's deepest insight here is more radical than a dismay about a long-emerging imbalance between the discursive and non-discursive. Rather, he views the demotion of the Dionysian as logos came to dominate, as in the end a kind of philosophical incoherence, a denial of the conditions of the possibility of logos. If I'm right in this reading, what is being said is that it is the non-discursive or non-representational, communal, thus the stress on the chorus, practices and collective memories and experiences that lie behind and make possible the discursively and linguistically articulated, the representational, the knowledgeable forms and norms that have come to occupy center stage. Thus, the effort to erase them is not just a distorting imbalance, it's a failure to comprehend their fundamental ineliminability. It is to treat a necessity as a mere dispensable contingency. If X makes Y conceptually possible, it cannot make coherent sense to allow Y to usher X out of centrality and significance. This suggests that the distinction between Apollonian and Dionysian lends itself to another distinction which came to be emphasized in a range of other philosophers since Nietzsche, Heidegger, John Searle, Charles Taylor, and so on. The distinction between foreground and background intended to mark what is explicit, the topic of conspicuous focus and discussion, and what is only implicit, but making possible the contents, indeed the very idea of whatever it is that is being explicitly discussed. It's just that because it is only in the background and only implicit, the centrality of its enabling role can be missed and even denied. With this further distinction in place, Nietzsche's insight can now be fully articulated as follows. It is only against a background of non-discursive human customs and habits and social history and memory that a foreground discursive field of logos, that is to say, of explicitly articulated concepts and knowledges and norms, makes sense and be what we take them to be. Okay, with this brief philosophical frameworking in place, let me turn to the idea of the commons. The commons is a subject which is almost impossible to hold in mind without remarking on its diminishment and destruction. We can't but think of the commons without observing how much they have receded from the early modern period down to the present day as a result of one or other form of enclosure upon them. Initially, the concept applied mostly to land, and I'm going to stick with the land commons. Scholars have described the large extent of the commons prior to their privatization all over Europe. Even when a landholder owned a rural estate, the peasantry had a range of what were described as usufructuary privileges and rights for growing crops, for grazing stock, for access to water and wood, and so on. In flatlands, the open field system, which was common property system, was a widely prevalent form of cultivation of arable ground. All of this changed with the enclosures, the fencing and subdividing into private plots with full and absolute private rights given to the owners. In the second half of the 17th century, we find for the first time in Locke's second treatise on civil government an explicit and fully worked out theoretical rationalization of the enclosures. By rationalization, I mean an account that literally rendered it rational, presenting the enclosures as a moral and political achievement. A loosely constructed version of that account, drawing on the famous chapter on property in that work and combining it with various other strands in Locke, including the familiar ideal of a social contract, might go as follows. In a conjecture past, there was an originary condition, call it the state of nature. Its inhabitants one day convene and agree by a mutual consent on a certain set of arrangements and principles to live by, thereby immediately transforming the state of nature into a polity, transforming themselves, hitherto merely people, into citizens. The social contract is rational, Locke says, if no inhabitant is made worse off by these arrangements, and many are indeed better off. That is, if there's a Pareto improvement over the state of nature. And B, the arrangements and principles to live by are freely consented to by all the inhabitants. A standard Lockean construction by which this gets exemplified is this. Some among the inhabitants freely decide that if any one of them comes upon a portion of the expanse and fences it, and registers the enclosed land with a primitive form of bureau set up for this purpose, he may declare it to be mine. Others in the group are left out of this process, but they're included in another role. The new possessors of enclosed parts of the land offer them work on their land for wages, something to which these non-possessors of land freely consent. And so it's claimed that everyone, both the possessors and the non-possessors of property, is better off than they were in the state of nature. As I said, this argument was widely seen as giving a theoretical legitimacy to the privatization of the commons that the enclosures wrought. But we also know that well before Locke's theoretical account, there was widespread resistance to the enclosures in early modern England. So let me introduce a counter-argument against this Lockean social contract and put it anachronistically in the mouths of some of the dissenters against the enclosures in that period, groups such as the Diggers, the radical levelers, not all the levelers, the radical levelers. I say anachronistically, not only because these dissenters predated Locke, but also because I'll be using a vocabulary in the formulation of the counter-argument that is ours, not theirs. Let us then ventriloquize onto the lips of the most prominent of these dissenters, Gerard Winstanley, the following counter-argument appealing to the notion of what economists call an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is an avoided benefit when we make a certain decision. He says to Locke, you're right. The privatization of the land and the recruitment of wage labor to work on the land does make everyone better off than they were in the state of nature. But it does not make them better off than they would have been, it's counterfactual, subjective, than they would have been if the land had not been privatized in the first place and there was a collective cultivation of the commons instead. This response to Locke that I've attributed to Winstanley explicitly mentions the commons, taking what Locke called a state of nature to be the commons, and claiming that we have a choice that Locke's argument overlooks. We could think of it as Locke does, but there's an opportunity cost in doing so. It avoids the alternative of thinking of it in terms of its collective cultivation. The matter cannot be said to rest there because a subsequent well-known move in the conceptual genealogy of the privatized ideal can be read as precisely arguing on behalf of Locke that a central assumption made by this argument from opportunity cost is untenable. This is the assumption that there is a cogent ideal of the collective cultivation of the commons. It has been famously argued that the assumption is not cogent at all. Here in the broader stroke is how that familiar argument goes, appealing to the game-theoretic framework of a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. The intractable problem is supposed to be that given human psychology, individual commoners are rationally required to behave in ways that undermine the collective. They're required to not cooperate in the way necessary to sustain the collective. The cooperation necessary for the collective ideal requires that each commoner pay a certain cost. Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, the cost takes the form of restraint, since overuse, overcultivation, overgrazing, etc., is often the problem. If each individual commoner pays the cost, of course everyone gains. But each individual commoner will have to consider that if he does not cooperate, that he does not pay the cost. If he doesn't pay the cost, the gains are immediate, whereas the gains from cooperation are long-term. Moreover, the gains from non-cooperation are all for himself, whereas the gains from paying the cost are spread over the whole group. Above all, and this is really the crucial and clinching consideration to which I'll keep returning, above all, he's never sure that if he pays the cost, others will do so too. Since one is in the epistemic dark about whether others are contributing, this is just the prisoner's dilemma part of it. Since one is in the epistemic dark about whether others are contributing the bit demanded of them in the collective cultivation, one constantly fears that one's own contribution will be wasted. For the purposes of this paper, I'm stressing this anxiety. What if I cooperated and others didn't? And not other parts of what is called the dominance argument. On such an understanding of the collective ideal, an individual commoner decides not to cooperate is always at an advantage, since the gains of non-cooperation will be immediate, all for himself, and completely assured. Whereas the gains from cooperating are long-term, dispersed over the whole group, and above all, always uncertain. Non-cooperation for him as an individual would thus be rational. But the commons cannot survive if each individual does this individually rational thing. It is doomed. Thus, the tragedy of the commons. So, privatization is a better bet. To this familiar game-theoretic updating of Locke, there has tended to be a standard response. The specter of the tragedy of the commons is exaggerated. The commons is not doomed to tragedy, since it can be governed by regulation, that is to say, by policing and punishing non-cooperation. Now, who can be against such regulation? It's obviously a good thing. What is less obvious is whether the idea of regulation itself escapes the kind of thinking that goes into generating the tragedy of the commons. The thinking just occurs one step up. Even if we ignore the well-known difficulties of detecting many non-obvious forms of non-cooperation, the question arises, why should someone cooperate with policing and detection and punishment if they can get away with not cooperating? By offering bribes, for instance, or making mafia-style threats against those who detect and police, or those who cooperate with policing and detecting, witnesses, for example. And in societies, such as this one, that pride themselves on having overcome a culture of bribes and threats, non-cooperation can be and is pursued by loopholing the laws and the regulations to make non-cooperation legal after all. Thus, though we should obviously support regulation, to view the possibility of regulation as a reason for not probing more deeply is to merely illustrate the treadmill cast of mind that finds itself constantly dogged by the thinking that generates the tragedy of the commons, and that mentality cannot be rectified by solutions like regulation. What is worth exploring then is something that allows us to dismount the treadmill, something that only an alternative way of thinking can offer. Einstein once said that we cannot solve our problems within the thinking that we used when we created them. How then might one probe the possibility that the mentality itself is not compulsory? To repeat, the question of regulation via law and norm and the application in policing and punishment requires cooperation just as much as the collective cultivation of the commons does, and the mentality, elevated into a form of rationality that drives the tragedy of the commons argument, should therefore be operative one step up and threaten to undermine regulation by law as well. How do we get past this mentality then and this impasse? The Lockean tradition will have it that there's no getting past it, but arguably this triumphant assumption on its part is only something it came to because it was looking in the wrong place for the answer. So questions arise. Where does it look for answers? Why does it not find them there? And where else might one look? It's just here that the notion of a background with which I opened this lecture impresses with its relevance. I had said, invoking Nietzsche among others, in my exposition of the notion of a background, that it is a non-discursive realm of practices and customs and social memory. And I now want to claim of it that it is quite proper, this background is quite properly thought of as a cultural commons, of which in turn I want to claim we can assert 5 distinct but related propositions. We have it. 1, that these cultural commons in the background, so you've got it on the screen, that these cultural commons in the background make possible the very idea of regulation and law and norm in the foreground. 2, that a particular feature of the cultural commons, whose true name and character I will leave to the very end, makes possible the implementability of regulation and laws in the foreground. Okay. So the cultural commons in the background makes possible the very idea of law and its contents, and a particular feature of it makes possible its implementability. 3, that these cultural commons are not an optional or cancelable commons. 4, that it is to this background of non-optional and non-cancelable commons in the background that we should be looking for the conceptual resources for the recovery, partial recovery, of the various other commons that seem to have become vulnerable to cancellation and optionality. 5, that the undisclosed feature of the background, which I will leave to the very end, is an ideal, but it is a very distinctive ideal because when it is working, it does not appear to be an ideal. Let me begin with 1, and to do so, I will make the point somewhat abstractly first, and then see its relevance through to law and norm in the usual sense. Consider then an example by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his well-known discussion of following a rule or norm. Wittgenstein's eventual interest is in rules of language. But the example he illustrates his ideas with is one of a road sign, an arrow pointing in a certain direction. That's the example he gives of a regulative norm. Whence the directive and regulative power of the sign that expresses a rule or norm to tell us to turn left, say? Where does it come from? How do the members of a group within which the sign has this directive power of a norm come to see it that way? It certainly can't be a matter of just free interpretation on the part of those who see the sign. It's not as if the sign is seen first merely as a physical configuration on a board to which each person who sees it gives a meaning or significance by an act of interpretation. Rather, each person in the group immediately and literally sees the sign as directing him or her to turn left. That is, the sign is seen as meaningful right from the outset, in the seeing itself. It's not as if first you see a purely physical configuration to which meaning has to be added by an interpretative feat that the viewer has to perform. Thus, we literally see meaning or normative significance or directive ruling in the sign when we see it. But what makes for this rich phenomenology of seeing meaning or norm and not merely a physical mark on a wooden board? what underlies this perceptual sensitivity in the group to signs of this kind, a sensitivity that a visitor from an alien group might not possess, and for whom no such directiveness may be apparent in the perception, with the lines on the wooden post being just that, lines on a wooden post, no more, and who would then have to struggle to find an interpretation. Wittgenstein's expression forms of life is intended to capture the range of background practices in the group's tradition that I mentioned, which literally gives sight to the group when it comes to reading such a road sign. We can make up a story in the background for this particular example. Let us say that members of the group have a social memory accumulated through a long tradition of oral relay, books, comics, films, and so on, of a set of practices in which arrows were or are used with bows to shoot at various targets, and so they've come to associate the direction of the flight of the arrow with its head in front as the direction with which the sign is associated. We can also imagine that in another culture, where arrows were merely used for decorative purposes and not for shooting, no such directional association of an arrow's flight takes a hold on the mentality of its members, and instead, with sufficient details added, what gets associated with the arrow's head is the place of origin rather than the sought destination. These details apart, the point is that it is only such a background of cultural practices, say target shooting and martial weaponry versus decorative practices, within which the sign's normative or rule directiveness of one or other kind is so much as possible in the foreground. The physical sign, qua physical sign, tells us nothing. It is only a culturation in a tradition of practices that makes possible to members of the group the sign's meaning and normative directiveness. There's no understanding the foregrounded field, therefore, where rules and norms and laws are in play, traffic rules in this case, without a taken for granted background of practices and social memory and implicitly unspoken, shared, non-discursive assumptions. The implication of this in general for the law and for explicit regulations in the realm of state and public policy are plain to see. We would not have any good sense of what laws are and what they mean and say and direct us to if we did not have a background of far less discursive and far less explicitly articulated traditions of shared practices. We are often reminded of this when things go amiss. There can be spectacular cases of mismatch that brings it out vividly. I believe Joan of Arc provides one such. Here was a mystic poet, a warrior saint, with no acculturation into the practices and unspoken shared assumptions that lay behind the law and its protocols to which she was subjected in a courtroom. It is small wonder that she was convicted. Everything in her background of practices and customs left her ill-prepared and ill-suited for the courtroom, with tragic consequences, not just her conviction, but also her complete and abject failure to even so much as comprehend the zeitgeist of the law court within which she had to present her defense, making the conviction a foregone conclusion. In fact, those who thought her insane may not have even quite seen that in the face of such wholesale incomprehension of the culture whereby the law is rendered rational, she had no option but to declare herself to be irrational. Less spectacular, subtler cases of mismatch reveal the same point. It was widely said by sociologists of the welfare state that for the first decade or more of the functioning of the National Health Service in post-war Britain, the class for whom it was primarily set up was the least able to exploit the benefits it offered to citizens, who were that class was just not at home, not brought up to be at home, in the culture that underlies the complicated set of rules that characterize the dispensation of welfare benefits. As a result, it was the educated middle class that was most able to take advantage of the National Health Service benefits. Sociologists are very clear on this, until gradual acculturation into the background practices underlying the foregrounded rules made these latter more straightforwardly intelligible and easier to navigate. In a word, without upbringing and participation in a cultural commons in the background, the law in the foreground remains opaque, much like the road sign remains merely paint on wood rather than a rule or norm. A different kind of case may be found in the utterly familiar problems generated by mismatching divergent backgrounds, what I'm calling the implicit cultural commons. In the case of migrations of communities of labor from erstwhile colonies invited into the European nations in the second half of the 20th century. Few governments showed the requisite sensitivity in handling these problems. In fact, recently, even so prominent a figure of the European left as Slavoj Zizek, who made an impeccably correct diagnosis that the causes of refugee migration from the Middle East to European nations are as a result of imperialist interventions, invasions, embargoes, etc., by European nations and the United States. Zizek then declares, after this impeccable diagnosis for what caused the refugee phenomenon, Zizek then goes on to say, sorry, I've lost my place. He goes on to say that the European nations, however, he says, should make clear that though the refugees are welcome for this reason, they should also understand well that they must accept our ways of life, our laws and norms, or else be subject to harsh state repression and punishment. With such insensitive attitudes, a total unwillingness to allow a new cultural commons to evolve through mutual engagement between guest and host communities, it's hardly surprising that acute problems have arisen over a wide range of matters in the foreground of the law, including such fundamental issues as free speech and the censorship of perceived blasphemy. These are the hard issues raised by the recognition of the background in shaping the law and its contents in the foreground. Now, moving on to two. If the background in this sense, the cultural commons, makes possible the very idea of law, a certain feature, I said, makes possible its implementation. Once again, before taking up law and norm in the public usual sense, I'm going to ease into it in a very abstract sense. In a careful analysis of the concept of human communicative meaning, the philosopher Paul Grice, H.P. Grice, proposes that a complicated set of intentions, nested intentions on the parts of speakers, underlies the nature of human linguistic communication. He first points out that it does not suffice to say that a speaker means something if he or she merely intends to get something across to someone. Of course, it's necessary that one has that intention, but it's not sufficient. Thus, Iago, placing a handkerchief in a suitably revealing place with the intention of getting something across to Othello, is not what goes on in linguistic communication, which is overt, and not, as with Iago, covert and manipulative. So, one needs to add a second intention for communicative meaning, that one intends the hearer to recognize that one is intending to convey something to him or her. And then, this is a wonderful point that he makes, and then Grice asks a crucial further question. He asks, if someone, so one is required to be overt and not manipulative in getting something across. But then he says, if someone overtly showed someone a photograph of some scene, X talking to Y, let's say, in the college quadrangle. If someone overtly showed someone a photograph of some scene with the intention of conveying to her that X was talking to Y in the college quadrangle, would that count as a case of human communication of the sort that goes on in language? Grice asks. No, he says. It would not, because even though this is overtly done, the photograph being the sort of thing it is, would convey that information to the hearer directly and by itself. And the hearer coming to have that information about X and Y being in the quadrangle bypasses the intentions of the speaker. This is a very subtle point. What Grice means by the photograph directly and by itself conveying the information and bypassing the speaker's intention is that, on the assumption that photographs don't lie, upon seeing the photograph, the hearer is immediately informed by the photograph of the information. The speaker hasn't told the hearer the information. The hearer has come to have that information by the photograph itself. And the speaker's intentions are not doing the communicative work in the reception of the hearer. That is, the photograph conveys the information anyway, making the speaker's intentions to convey it inessential to the process by which the hearer comes to have the information. Compare this, Grice says, to the speaker drawing or painting for the hearer a picture of X, or for the viewer, a picture of X talking to Y in the quadrangle. Now we have human communication in the full sense, says Grice, that one finds in language. Drawings, unlike photographs, require the hearer or viewer to acquire the information via a grasp of the full range of intentions that the speaker has. The information is not conveyed anyway by the drawing, as it is by the photograph, that being the difference between photographs and drawings. Now, essential to this point of Grice is that photographs don't lie. Now, someone might object that in this age of spin, as we well know, people can just doctor photographs or even create them in a darkroom with chemicals and paper, so long as there's a shaft of light from the outside. But I think Grice would have argued, surely correctly, that when that happens, all these cases of spin, etc., when that happens, these are really paintings with photographic materials. They're not photographs. Photographs are defined by a causal link between the photograph and what the photograph is a photograph of. If one has no such causal link and just plays with photographic materials in a darkroom or on a computer to produce a representation of X talking to Y in the college quadrangle, that looks like a photograph, but that is superficial. It is just a painting with photographic materials. So to ensure that the hearer goes via the intentions of the speaker to acquire the information, that say X was speaking to Y in the quadrangle, Grice says that the speaker must have a third intention, the intention that the hearer acquire the information as a result of recognizing the intention on the part of the speaker to convey that. That rules out the photograph, it rules in the drawing and painting, and that's what goes on in linguistic utterances. But now notice, there's a very striking implication of what is registered about the nature of language and communication by the need for this third further intention that Grice has established. What it shows is that the possibility of misrepresentation and lying is essential for something to count as a case of communication as it is found in language. If there's no possibility of lying and misrepresentation, no possibility of lying and misrepresentation, we don't have a case of linguistic communication, even if we get things across to people. But on the other hand, I'm speaking on that's clear from Grice. I think Grice doesn't make this point explicit, but it's obvious from what I've said. But on the other hand, and equally obviously, if linguistic communication is going to be effective at all, misrepresentation and lying can't be ubiquitous either. Therefore, there are twin requirements in language which pull in different directions. One is that there must be the possibility of something, misrepresentation and lying, and the other is that the actualization of this possibility is only exceptional and occasional and can't be routine. What this discussion invoking Grice's analysis brings out, then, is that the notion of trust and reliability is vital to the communicative efficacy of language, and since linguistic communication is a central enabling condition of individuals coming together in a social group, it is a vital part of the idea of a social set of relations. This point is so obvious, it really should hardly need saying. That's how analytic philosophy does. It spells things out in a way that make it so obvious that you wonder why anybody needed to say it. Okay, so here's why it's so obvious. You stop at someone on the street and ask her the time, and she looks at her watch and tells you. It's the telling that's communicative. If she showed you the watch, your coming to know the time would be done directly by what you see when you look at the watch, bypassing the overt communicative intentions on her part to convey the time to you. But if she's telling you and not showing you her watch, you have to trust her to not be lying and misinforming you. And we do this unselfconsciously and by and large without exception. Trust is the default. One has to be aware of some unusual circumstance to put the trust on hold. And for the most part, the trust is deserved. Most people are not waiting to mislead you by telling you the wrong time when you ask them. This point about language is manifestly generalizable. If such a background of trust in everyday relations within the group informs the everyday practices and customs and habits that lie behind and make possible the possibility of language, it also constitutes the cultural commons that makes the possibility of the law's implementation. I have here an example from cricket, which I won't give you because none of you will have forget about not knowing about it. You won't have any interest in it. And I might lose you for the rest of the paper. Consider many commercial companies. I'm not going to give you the cricket, sir. Sometimes even well-intentioned companies. They resolve to set up what they call ethical codes of auditing to make sure that the company is, say, ecologically sound or fair in its trading practices, or whatever. It's repeatedly reported that in many companies, such audits deteriorate into ritualized ticking of the boxes so that the company can congratulate itself for its virtue, but this amounts to no more than a shallow observance of laws without a wide range of actions that pass the audit, which are manifestly violations of it. Another wonderfully crude, amusing example was recently in the news when campus rules, in some campus, I think maybe, I can't remember which campus, maybe a Mormon college, when campus rules on a certain campus forbade utterances of obscenities in public. And the students then came and sat next to each other in groups of 4, each wearing a T-shirt with the letter F, U, and so on. No rule could be found against them to punish them. Adding another rule exposed to the rule book to cover this sort of behavior would just generate new and more ingenious forms of violation of it. Until you'd get, if you keep adding rules, you get a vast and insanely complex almanac of rules that would and could only be understood and kept tracked by lawyers, turning the whole campus into a cesspool of professionalized expertise, as we already know from even a glance at the small print that accompanies a wide range of medicines and medical procedures. Ubiquitous examples of this kind show that in the end, nothing short of a background of mutual trust and relations in the members of a group can ensure that the law will not be finessed in a myriad unforeseen ways. None of this is to say that the law and regulation are not necessary. It is only to say that the effectiveness in the foreground of the law depends fundamentally and ultimately on the character of trust that lies in the background, which have no discursively explicit articulation and rule book in which they may be found. Okay, so we've arrived at something of a punchline then on the questions that we have left hanging. The long Lockean tradition of thought on this subject comes to its conclusions only because of the way in which it poses its problems. That question was, why is not the solution to the prospect of the tragedy of the commons that appeals to the regulation of the commons via laws formulated and implemented against non-cooperation subject to being undermined by the same considerations that undermined the commons in the first place? That was my question. To put the question that way is to assume that if the problem arises, so here's the punchline. To put the question that way is to assume that if the problem arises in the foreground, where law and norm are formulated and regulation are on their basis is implemented, that its solution to the problem must also lie in the foreground. But that assumption is wrong. The resources for seeking a solution lie in the background, and this background of a cultural commons, without which the foreground's laws could not so much as be meaningfully formulated, is not even recognized by that tradition. Indeed, the very distinction between the foreground and the background is not recognized. This is a point of some significance in the history of these subjects. So, for instance, much of Foucault's anxiety about the emergence of a new form of penality with the Enlightenment, not that he puts it in this way that I'm about to. I'm presenting his anxieties in terms of the conceptual distinction that I've been drawing here. So Foucault's anxiety about Enlightenment penalty, is my way of putting it, was precisely that the foreground of law and regulation was claiming to be all the ground there is. That's how Foucault should have formulated his anxiety. What he did was to say, in modernity, you've got a new kind of penality, it's law, discretion goes out, and so on and so forth. Right? So he's got this picture of slabs of categorized time, pre-modernity, modernity, and all. And my claim is that the real anxiety that he should have expressed is that the foreground of law and regulation was claiming to be all the ground there is. It's a quite different formulation of the anxiety. Now, what cannot be denied, of course, is that all the many examples of the sort I've given above, about how laws and norms are often finessed, reflect how we can lapse from the relations of trust that regulation by law presupposes in the cultural commons in the background. Obviously, the point cannot be that such lapses from those relations of trust never occur. That would be to deny the manifest facts of various enclosures that we daily lament. But that it is only because those relations exist my point is only that I'm not denying that there's a lot of lapse. I'm just saying it's only because that background exists with this feature that the law is implemented to the considerable extent that it is implemented. The cultural commons' relation to the law is thus constitutive. In this respect, such a commons amounts to an ideal in much the same way that principles of rationality are ideals that are constitutive of the very idea of human thought. We can lapse from these principles. We can be irrational by being inconsistent. We can be irrational by having intransitivities in our desire, but it would not be thought or thinking we possess if such irrationality was pervasive. As I said, it is often the case that there's quite an extensive lapse or breakdown of these relations of trust in the background. As we well know from history, complex societies have sometimes collapsed. The argument I'm making, therefore, should not be seen as encouraging any kind of complacence. In fact, I would read the fascinating and profound transitional moment in South Africa as a case in which Bishop Tutu and his colleagues, including Mandela, having realized that as a result of the long and searing experience of apartheid, those relations of trust in the background had broken down far too extensively in their society. They therefore devised something quite dramatically novel for the criminal trial of transitional justice with a very specific end in mind. They sought to correct that damage to the trust that is normally present implicitly in the background, unselfconsciously present in the background. They've got to correct that damage by modeling transitional criminal law in the foreground, explicitly and self-consciously, on the model of these relations of trust in the background, rather than on the standard procedures of criminal law. They roughly argued, we have to live side by side with our past oppressors. So let us not judge them forensically in a traditional court of law, seeking and presenting evidence in a disengaged mode while they sit silently in the dark. Let us not assess them in that detached mode, applying our norms and laws. Let us engage with them, seeking truths about the past through that engagement, trusting them to present the truth of their perpetration of crimes, and look to what correction these confessions make possible for our future together. But again, if my conceptual analysis is right, even that fascinatingly innovative strategy of a thoroughly revisionary model of criminal law in the foreground will have presupposed its own background of shared assumptions and so on. What this reveals is that the term trust that I've been using freely and repeatedly in characterizing these customs and practices in the background of the cultural commons is not quite the right word for the ideal that the cultural commons exemplifies. It is convenient to use it because it is the most obvious word or concept at hand, and it has been the subject of much sophisticated theorizing in recent years. Trust, as the South African experimental moment makes clear, can be foregrounded in an explicit formulation of what is being displayed in a formal trial. In this respect, the concept of trust is like the concept of cooperation. We found, for instance, that responses to the argument for the tragedy of the commons claim that cooperation can be enforced by policing and punishment of non-cooperation. Policing and punishment with the application of laws is precisely a foregrounded phenomenon. So these overused terms, trust, cooperation, can characterize tacit and inarticulate features of human relations, but they can also be brought forward to the discursive forefront in explicit formulations, as Bishop Tutu clearly did. Let me then discard those terms and explore more carefully the nature of the ideal that the cultural commons, playing the background role I've given it, most deeply expresses. Quite apart from their susceptibility to being foregrounded in explicitly formal and discursive formulations, the inappropriateness of explicitly normative terms like trust and cooperation to describe the social relations typical of the cultural commons lies partly in the fact that these terms give the impression that what is being proposed via the very idea of a cultural commons is a sort of moral or moralistic critique of a notion of self-interest. That's not what I'm doing. I think, by contrast, it's important to present the ideal of the cultural commons and the work it is doing in my argument in a light that stresses not the moralistic aspects of such a critique, but, as I said earlier, an alternative mentality that does not even appear to be a moral ideal when it is working. It's not so much a matter of declaring the idea of self-interest to be morally wrong, but rather a matter of what does and does not arise in one's mind or mentality. Thus, to the extent that the ideal exemplified in the cultural commons is working, it is, as it were, an epistemological or cognitive achievement. Let me try to explain this by returning to the issue with which I concluded my construction of the dialectical dispute between Locke and Winston Lee over the commons. Let's then go back to see how best to describe and understand the mentality that is central to the idea of rationality that the argument for the tragedy of the commons invokes, in order to undermine the idea of the commons and its collective cultivation. The crucial step I identified in the argument was when the commoner is supposed to have the driving anxiety and qualm. What if I cooperated and others did not? That would be the worst possible outcome for me. So, we should be asking, what does an anxiety and qualm of this sort reflect or reveal? And rather than simply say it reveals a lack of trust and refusal to cooperate, Saying that is hardly informative, since we already know from the general thrust of the argument's direction and conclusion, we know that. We should look for a deeper underlying malaise that prompts an anxiety and qualm of that kind. There's a completely intuitive and familiar description of this malaise that is available from many writings of Marx and a wide legacy of Marxian thought, influenced by his early work, Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Though Marx in that work was focused on the conditions of labor in particular, and was therefore speaking in detail primarily of the affliction of a particular class, even just a slight abstraction from that specific context suggests the following wholly natural thought. It is only if individuals in a group were deeply alienated from each other that they would be prompted to anxiously ask, what if I cooperated and others did not? This suggests that if the cultural commons was doing its work, and one were to get past the mentality that rationality requires of us in the argument of the tragedy of the commons, the ideal expressed in the cultural commons would be the ideal of an unalienated mentality. And conversely, there is no better elaboration of what an unalienated mentality is than to say that if one is unalienated, the anxiety or qualm, what if I pay the cost of cooperation, others do not, would not so much as occur to one. I emphasize these last words, would not so much as occur to one, because the idea, as I said, is not that it's morally wrong for that thought or anxiety or question to occur to one. It's rather simply that that question does not compute. I repeat then that the point is cognitive, not moral. To stress unalienatedness as a mentality is to stress something quite different from other ideals like fraternity or solidarity with others. Different from the demand that we shun self-interest and regard the interests of others. It's a more abstract idea, one of a certain form of thinking and mentality within which anxieties of the sort that drive the argument that renders cooperation irrational are simply preempted from surfacing in one's mind. Thus, one is not simply countering non-cooperation with the idea of cooperation. It's not a contest of opposing ideals in the foreground. One is claiming, rather, that non-cooperation emerges from an underlying malaise, a deformation of mentality that we call alienation, and that the anxiety that leads rationally to non-cooperation is a symptom of that malaise. Indeed, that game theory may itself be a higher-order symptom of that malaise. One is claiming, moreover, that the overcoming of the malaise and the attaining of the ideal of unalienatedness is a cognitive achievement. To elaborate a little, to have about 3 or 4 minutes more? Yeah. To elaborate a little more fully the idea of an unalienated life, which I'm at pains to distinguish from other ideals like fraternity, solidarity, for that matter, liberty and equality. Notice that the striking thing about this is that the ideal of unalienatedness, so understood, when it's working, does not seem to be an ideal. It is only when we fall away from it, as in the commoners' driving anxiety about whether others will cooperate or not, that the unalienatedness appears as an ideal, something we need to say. This is the point I've been harping on when I've consistently characterized the background of the cultural commons as being largely non-discursive and tacit. In this sense, the ideal of unalienatedness, which the cultural commons exemplifies, is quite unlike the ideals of, say, liberty and equality that find their constant and explicit articulations in codes, in constitutions, and in policies. This point about the ideal not appearing to be an ideal when it's working becomes clear if we draw an analogy with a point that Wittgenstein makes in his well-known discussion of the notion of a basic action in the characterization of human intentionality. Wittgenstein claimed that one could not understand human intentionality as it applies to human actions unless we understood the idea of what he called a basic action. A basic action is something we do, and we don't do anything else in virtue of which we do it. So, adapting a famous example of his, let's make an intentional action of waving to a friend. Wittgenstein says, philosophers have tended to say that an intentional action like waving to a friend conceptually breaks down into more basic actions, such as, say, my moving my arm, and then something even more basic, a non-action, such as my arm moving. On their view, typical analytic philosophers' analytical breakdown of the idea of waving to a friend, on their view, the philosophical picture is that the arm going up is basic, and to it, successive intentions accrue. The first intention might be, I intend that my arm move. That yields the non-basic action of my moving my arm. The next accretion to this is the intention that by my moving my arm, I wave to a friend. That in turn yields the even less basic action of my waving to a friend. And Wittgenstein says that this picture of intentional action is all wrong. He says, if I wave to a friend, the basic action just is my waving to a friend. That's it. There is no other action in virtue of which I do it. So in the standard cases of intentional action, there's no breakdown of intentional action into more and more basic action components. Now, someone might say, why are you wheeling in this analogy with Wittgenstein? It's completely irrelevant. Your subject is normative, an ideal, the ideal of an unalienated mentality, which you say is exemplified in the relations and practices that comprise the cultural commons. Wittgenstein's not talking of an ideal at all. He's talking of the nature of intentional action, which he says is a basic action and has no conceptual breakdown into more basic actions. But this objection misses the point of what Wittgenstein is saying and what I take the ideal of an unalienated mentality to be. Wittgenstein is indeed talking of something normative as well. He is talking of an ideal. It's just that it does not look like an ideal when it's working. And we can bring this out by imagining a case when the ideal is not working. So suppose that I've been recently estranged from my friend. And suppose I want to recover normal, friendly relations with him. Well, given the estrangement, so I've been estranged with my friend, and I want to recover the friendship. Given the estrangement, there's a kind of shrinkage in me, and I may not be able to just wave to him with the same unself-conscious, easy act that I usually do when I see him across the quad. Hence, I might think in this shrinkage through estrangement, I might think, let me move my arm in a vigorous way and hope that it comes off as a friendly waving. In such cases, I've lapsed from an ideal because of the estrangement and the ensuing shrinkage in me, and the moving of my arm, and the moving of my arm rather than the waving to a friend is indeed the basic action. It is a case of having lapsed from the ideal of intentionality in action that Wittgenstein had proposed. It's just that in the normal cases, where there is no shrinkage, everything proceeds in the waving unself-consciously and easily, and we do not even notice that an ideal is being exemplified. Only the lapses from the ideal bring out that it is an ideal that is at stake and in play in Wittgenstein. The situation is exactly the same with unalienatedness. When the ideal is working, it doesn't seem to be an ideal. And the qualm, what if I cooperated and others did not, does not occur to the individuals in the group. But if the qualm does occur, we are alerted to having run up against an ideal from which we've lapsed. It's precisely because of this exceptional feature of the ideal of an unalienated life and mentality that it would be a comical aspiration to insert the ideal into a constitution, as we've done with other ideals, or even into a slogan, as has been done with liberty, equality, fraternity. One cannot even do with it what Tutu and Mandela sought to do with trust in their remarkable model for transitional justice as non-forensic engagement with perpetrators of crime, in which trust was explicitly inserted into the formulation of the point of its confessional procedure in the foreground. The unalienated life and mentality are essentially non-discursive ways of being that characterize our practices in the background. When they go missing, and we are suddenly reminded as a result that they amount to an ideal, we of course speak explicitly of alienation and the ideal of its overcoming, and give lengthy academic lectures about it. As Marx says in his writings on the subject, being unalienated is an ideal that's constitutive of what we are when we are most representatively human. And in fact, I think many religious ways of life have consistently exemplified it. It's not an optional ideal. It's not a cancelable ideal. To deny it is to deny, as he put it, our species being. When we lapse from it, often extensively as we have, we may need to strive to transform the social and economic formations and institutions that have induced the alienation. Marx himself had a detailed and rightly famous diagnosis, as we know, of what does induce it and what has to be transformed. Those are the large and urgent issues that beset us in our modernity and set us our practical tasks. All I've sought to do in this lecture is to see through, via the notion of a cultural commons that's non-discursive in the background, the conceptual implications for the ideal itself when we see the lapse from the ideal as manifest in one of the most frequently expressed and theoretically mobilized anxieties in the foreground of our social lives in modernity. What if I cooperated and others did not? Thanks very much.
Two more days.
Yes.
Also 2 more days, right?
Good.
For most of the conference. We
Good.
need to, we can go a tiny bit over, but the transportation is leaving at 5:45.
I'll try to be quick. Thank you so much, Professor Bilgrami. I was, perhaps because the name of our project is Beyond Secularization, I was hearing you speak in historical terms, and I couldn't help but sort of receive your parsing of The Birth of Tragedy as a story of the eclipse of the commons, as also perhaps a parable of secularization, or maybe Protestantization, that is the emergence of the sort of individuated Apollonian hero from the chorus seemed to be a story of one
Yes.
form of religious organization giving way to another, right? A form of religious organization focused on
Yes.
the non-discursive, the non-representational, the liturgical, the real presence, giving rise to the sermonic, the interpretive, the privatized. So where does that leave us? I was thinking, as you were speaking at the end about the non-alienated state, another word for that many of us would use is a state of enchantment. It doesn't surprise me that many communitarian voices today are Catholic or Catholic curious. That is, that they're trying to return to something that seems to precede the Reformation or the Reformation model of the individual. So where does that leave us? How do we, think in terms of trust, background, the non-discursive sense of agreement we don't even notice when it's working, without being nostalgic or without wanting to go back to something that is no longer.
So my redirecting of Foucault in that brief remark was partly speaking to your excellent question. You see, my anxiety is that starting with Weber and his angle on disenchantment and so on, and Foucault's quite completely different understanding of modernity, that there's a tendency to think that all this is really a feature of the modern period. That it's, but the point that I'm drawing from Heidegger and And these things have been picked up by people like Charles Taylor. What I'm trying to do, rather, is to say that we should just stop thinking of, secularization, modernity, and so on as emerging in a sort of slab of categorized time which we now inhabit, but rather to say that there are pockets of unalienatedness, enchantment, whatever. Modernity is not, the reach of modernity is not comprehensive. And I don't just mean that it's not comprehensive because the environment, we can learn so much from indigenous communities, which, all that is true. I don't deny it. And in fact, we might destroy all our future generations if we don't pay much more attention to our indigenous communities. The whole epistemological outlook is something that we need to learn from. Otherwise, we might be doomed in quite different comments. But I'm not even talking about the reach of modernity not being comprehensive because there are these. I'm saying in each one of us, we might be, each one of us, if I'm right, goes in and out of alienation. And so the way I think of it is, I really think of it as what some psychologists, this is done by people like Tversky and so on, they talk of a frame problem. It's a very simple idea. The idea of a frame is that each one of us today, in our full up-to-the-minute modernity, right, each one of us very often thinks in different frames. And the idea of a frame, which I'm invoking from, this is just, is that a frame got insulated boundaries, so that what one thinks in one frame just doesn't have any inferential link with what we think in another frame. So we don't even often realize we're being inconsistent, because we are in completely insulated frames. So in one frame, I might, happily pay the cost of cooperation. In another frame, I certainly won't. I will have the anxiety that, which the game theory makes into a notion of rationality. So in one frame I might be totally alienated, some frame might be, and I don't even know that I'm being inconsistent, right? And I believe that the goal of a humane politics should be partly, the goal of humane politics has many goals, but one very important goal of a humane politics is to remove the boundary between these frames in the population, so that people realize their inconsistencies and deploy the one frame, what they're thinking in one frame, as a critical resource in criticizing what one thinks in the other frame. Now, of course, I'm not Whiggish. I don't think it may go the other way, right? I mean, I have no sort of rosy Whiggish conclusion to draw, but I think what we don't often attribute to a humane politics is this very important goal. Marx talks of consciousness raising and all, but consciousness raising isn't just a matter of getting people to have solidarity. It's a much subtler thing. I actually think that the people who've really thought harder about this kind of thing are philosophers, ranging from Gandhi, for instance, much more than Marx. Marx focuses on other things and very powerfully, but I think there's much more subtle moral psychology of politics that one has to discuss, and which is just not there in Marx.
So thanks for that really interesting lecture. I want to go back to the comment you made about Descartes at the very beginning, or very close to the beginning.
Descartes, yeah.
Descartes, and what was your very nice statement that the possibility of the possibility of the impossibility of knowledge of the world implies the possible non-existence of the world. The world resides in in the possibility of knowledge. But if one draws a sort of simplistic line forward from Descartes in his moment, one could see that also as a sort of moment of the invention of an alternative commons, right? I mean, there is the anti-commons of the Lockean picture, in which a particular kind of self-interested rationality plays out in through the modes of human behavior appropriate to it, and you get the picture that you described. But at the same time, and this is a sort of follow-up to the enchantment question, it seems to me that's itself a moment of a kind of enchanted promise, a profoundly logocentric enchanted promise that recovers a commons whose foreground is the techniques of natural philosophy, but whose background is nature. And that is the guarantor of a kind of commons that doesn't rely upon the forms of tacit normativity, the unalienated stuff of a kind of collective solidaristic cultural being, but rather can displace it with a sort of universalism that locates itself in something that is sort of more fundamental, and from the rest of which a kind of, well, a commons, not a material commons, but an epistemological commons.
Nature.
Nature.
And our ways of seeing nature and taking in nature.
So my question is that if one takes the sort of orientation that you've taken to essentially the problem of property, right, and takes the same orientation towards the figure of nature, one can certainly make the arguments that you have made about the conditions of possibility for knowledge of it. That seems very straightforward.
Yeah.
But what about the project of knowledge of it as a project of the constitution of a kind of a commons to which other things are then meant to be tethered?
Well, that's a very deep and wonderful question. Thank you. My own view is that thinking of nature as the commons in that way is you'd have to. Here's how you'd have to do it, I think. First of all, you'd have to see nature as enchanted, by which I don't necessarily mean sacralized. It could be secular enchantment. It's partly what my book is about, the secularism book. But it would mean, I think, that when one had one's, as you say, cognitive relations to nature, one's perceptual relations to nature, if nature was enchanted, if nature, including social habitus, was enchanted, one would have to perceive nature making normative demands on us. And I think in one of those papers in that volume, I argued that you'd have to, each one of us would have to see nature's demands. This is, ethics would now be a perceptual discipline, and we would have to see nature's, or the world ahead of us, the world around us, the demands it's making, from a point of view larger than one's own. Right? Nature would be demanding of us that we see it from a point of view larger than one's own. And there's nothing mysterious about this. Right? It seems, what does that mean? What is it for me to see the world's demands? Think of the biological, think of a physical example. I think I give it in one of the papers. Think of a physical example. What's the difference between my walking on the road and my driving on the road? My walking on the road, my orientation, this is just in Merleau-Ponty, it's not in Merleau-Ponty, but it's just extrapolating from Merleau-Ponty. When I'm walking on the road, I see someone in front of me, and I just, from the point of view of my bodily orientation, I move and walk away. when I'm driving on the road, if I stuck to my bodily orientation, I'd crash the car. Right? I have to see the world as I drive from a point of view larger than my own body's point of view. I have to see it from the point of view of the body of the car. Right? So that's exactly, we need to extrapolate that physical example, bodily example to the social. And I think that's really, that's what nature would be demanding of us in this. So the cognition would be, and I think how to relate that kind of point to the points I've been making here would be one of the challenging theoretical tasks. And I've got both these claims, and I haven't integrated them, and your question tells me that I've got work ahead. But thank you very much. It's a wonderful question.
I think I'm going to take the prerogative as the person who's holding the microphone to ask a final question.
Yes.
And it's going to be a bit more pedestrian than some of the other ones. And I'd like you, if you would, I'd like to invite you to say a few words more, disclose a bit more about this heretofore undisclosed feature of alienation. And maybe I could ask if you would maybe say a few words speak as a citizen. Help us, for those who don't have the deep affection for Marx, understand why alienation is so important. What is it? How is it revealed in our world today? What does it look like? What are the problems that this new way of looking at things is going to help us understand better?
Yeah. Well, I think there's no doubt that Marx himself was completely schizophrenic on this. I mean, he partly because, the way you have to, I think that the only way you can read Marx to make him come out more humane and less scientistic. These are just cliched terms. You might find a more refined way of putting it, but is, I think, to read the very late Marx of his last decade, which is where he was writing about the Russian peasant commune, the Mir, and the early Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts and a few other texts. I think you have to read Capital through the lens of both these very early and very late Marx, or early and very late Marx. And I think Capital begins to read differently if you do. And the point of the very late Marx of the Russian Mir is a total acknowledgement that in countries like Russia, indeed countries like India, he mentions it in that famous exchange with Vera Zesulic, there is just no doubt that he says none of this unalienatedness is possible. None of these radical transformations are possible unless you have a very decentralized form of governance. In fact, Elinor Ostrom's book on the commons is actually pointing us to that direction. And so, the first initial stab is to say, unless we have tremendously revised, decentralized forms, both of governance and of political economy, none of these what is to be done questions that you're keen to could be addressed. And of course, as in her famous Nobel lecture, Elinor Ostrom talks about how you can't just go back to these childish village community ideas that, as Lenin put it, of the Narodniks. You have to really be polycentric. You have to find a way of acknowledging that we are stuck with a fair amount of industrialization, with a fair amount of centralization of governance and so on. And so you have to be polycentric. You have to sort of take that, go to particular local communities and so on, and see, where it is that autonomy should be granted, where it can't be, going back and forth. These things have protocols which you have to formulate, and she formulates it, she studies 4 continents and does it extremely astutely for the commons of various kinds. You just have to write that large, I think, and each society has to do it for its no easy answers.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and please, if you would, join me in thanking Professor Bilgrami.